This special release podcast episode was originally recorded during the 2022 Beyond Clean Expert Series Conference, the industry's only 100% PowerPoint-free educational event. If you prefer to watch this interview, you can access it and over 200 other CE programs by visiting beyondclean.net. Thanks for listening and keep fighting dirty.
What's up, Sterile Processing Universe? My name is Bobby Parker with Beyond Clean, and you are watching the Beyond Clean Expert Series Conference. We want to welcome you, and again, thank you for spending your Friday with us. If this is the first session that you're tuning into today, we want to say welcome, and as a brief introduction, this is our only PowerPoint-free conference for the year, which is a different format, kind of exciting, getting to see the faces of some experts in the field and just listen in on some back-and-forth discussion, and so it's going to be a great session. Today's session is the low in workflow. We're going to hear from a hydrogen peroxide expert who puts the low in workflow today. And before we jump into it, I just want to say thank you to our event partner, Power Supply, as well as our collaborator on this event, First Case, and their support in getting us nursing credits for this conference. Our speaker today and our interview is going to be with Jean-Luc Lemyre. He is a senior manager of research and development at Stryker and is the low-temp sterilization expert at Beyond Clean. His experience has been primarily in the technology surrounding hydrogen peroxide. He's been involved in several improvements along with regulatory clearances in this space and is an active member on a standards development committee with AMI and ISO. I'll be conducting the interview today, and we're going to be talking specifically about hydrogen peroxide. It's everywhere around us, but compared to steam, our industry still has a long way to go in understanding the true potential of this modality. We're going to talk about the benefits of low-temp sterilization, how it relates specifically to quality, efficiency, and cost savings in the sterile processing environment. So buckle up and get ready to discover what the future holds for this sterilization method. And join me in welcoming in Jean-Luc Lemyre.
Hey, hello, Bobby.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So, Jean-Luc, as we get things started today, I thought we would just do a bit of an introduction. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what your background is, and why specifically you love low-temp sterilization?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background and primary training is in chemistry. So I've got a PhD in chemistry from Université Laval. I live in Quebec City, and I've been involved in research and development for all my career. So right now I'm a senior manager with Stryker in R&D. But I joined the field of sterilization with TSO3 in 2016, and then TSO3 was acquired by Stryker 2 years ago. So now I lead a team of scientists and engineers that work on product improvement to help SPD worker. So what I love about sterile processing, first I would say is the mission of infection prevention. So if what I do today can help one patient infection, I think that would be a success. But I think it's probably true of all of your guests. So something maybe a bit more personal. I really love the science. So when I interview for TSO3, before that, I've read some of the patents for low temperature sterilization and realized there's a very cool science and technology behind it. And as a scientist myself, that's really what got me into that field. So now I love the mission, but primarily I like the science around it too.
Yeah, that's really cool. So a lot of us who end up in sterile processing end up stumbling into it by accident or discovering this really interesting niche of healthcare that many of us didn't know existed. And so is research and development for healthcare what you've always dreamed of doing? Are you living your dream job? Or how did you stumble specifically into healthcare and sterile processing?
Yeah, I think I would say I'm living my dream job, but I didn't know it was specifically in healthcare before. So I knew I wanted to do research. I started doing R&D in the field of protective equipment, and then kind of just stumbled into that position and realized that R&D is great, but doing it in healthcare really is meaningful for the community and the people around us.
Yeah, absolutely. Having that passion to be able to share. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, before we get to talking specifically about sterile processing, I'm curious about what it's like working in the research and development side of disinfectants and sterilization. What kind of impact does that have on you personally? Like, are you a clean freak at home? Do you have any thoughts about how disinfectants are used just in life around us?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm a clean freak, but I mean, I've got a chemistry background, but since I've been involved here, I've learned a lot about microorganism and microbiology in general. And I think in my day-to-day, I see opportunity for contamination kind of everywhere, and kind of, got to deal with it, especially since COVID. I think we're all thinking that way now. So yeah, I think that's an impact on my day-to-day.
Yeah, I think that that perspective on microbial life is important and needed. I'm thinking back to my time working in sterile processing departments, and we would have, say, a plumbing issue in the decontamination area, and the facilities guys would come in with no PPE on and just start grabbing decontam sinks and working on plumbing, and you'd have to go and ask them to please put some PPE on while they're handling these surfaces, and they're like, nah, I've been doing this for 20 years, it's not going to hurt me.
So you explain the risk of the invisible. So
that's right.
It's very human to not be concerned about things we don't see or smell, but it's really the case for microorganism and pathogen.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you had mentioned to me that the emphasis of your study and work is specifically in hydrogen peroxide. So help us nerd out a little bit here. Tell us about what hydrogen peroxide is, why it's a good disinfectant, what it's used for, things like that.
Yeah. So hydrogen peroxide is fairly small and very simple molecule. It's H2O2. It's very close to water in its structure, but has very different properties. It typically is always mixed with water in the way you would use it, either at home or in SPD. So for sterilization, it's very concentrated, 50 to 59%, but for just casual disinfection of surface, it's much less concentrated. And the reason why it's working so well, it's a very reactive molecule. So it oxidizes surfaces of microorganism, and that's how it kills the bugs, basically. Because it's a very reactive molecule, though, it tends to degrade. So in the Sterile that is sold commercially, there's typically some stabilizer to make sure it does not degrade on the shelf, and it's good up to its period of use. So that's an important consideration for user to make sure that they follow the proper storage condition, because if it's not properly stored, it will start degrade in the bottle, and then you basically have just water left.
Wow, yeah. And so I imagine that also brings some benefits with it as well, because when it degrades, you're left with just water and oxygen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very important point for peroxide. It's good at sterilizing and killing bugs, but the byproduct basically are water and oxygen itself. So it's very safe byproduct. So that's one of the good reasons to use it in low temperature sterilization and other disinfection use as well.
Yeah. So before we get into the vaporized hydrogen peroxide, which is going to be the emphasis of our conversation today, any other comments about hydrogen peroxide, maybe other industries that it's used in and what it's useful for?
Yeah, it's a good bleacher. If you would see it, you can bleach different color with it. So it's used in textile industry, I think in paper industry as well. It can be used as rocket fuel, as very concentrated, because it degrades very quickly. Wow.
That's wild. And so I imagine our listeners are fairly familiar with the chemistry of hydrogen peroxide, at least how it would be used in a sterilizer. But it's also interesting. I mean, you can buy this stuff at Walgreens, over the counter to use in really, really low concentrations. Just how reactive or dangerous is hydrogen peroxide in those higher concentrations of, 50, 60, 70%?
Yeah, it's very reactive. Should avoid any contact with for example, paper, cellulosic material, it can spontaneously start fires, actually. So that's one of the consideration of the design of the container in the low temp sterilizer, to make sure that there's no waste basically at the end. So you want to make sure that everything is drawn from the sterilizer, goes in the catalyst, and that if your user put the bottle in a trash can, for example, they're not at risk of starting a fire.
Wow, yeah. So and I'm jumping ahead of us here, but that just sparked an interesting thought. Is that reason about hydrogen peroxide, spontaneously combusting around paper and cellulose products, is that why low temp sterilizers instruct you not to put any cellulose-based products in there? Like if you had a bunch of paper in there, is that the big risk factor?
I think there's different risks there. If you've got cellulosic material into it, it tends to absorb a lot of the peroxide. So I think you've got kind of two risks there. It can remove peroxide that should be available for sterilization efficacy, and then it get absorbed in the cellulosic material. And then if it absorbs too much and your cellulosic material is at risk of, you'll get burned touching it out of the sterilizer.
Right, yeah. So if it absorbs it, I guess there would be less to go around for the rest of the chamber, and then, it'd be hard to evacuate it afterwards. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Anything that may react with the peroxide and make it less available for sterilization efficacy in a sterilizer is problematic. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about hydrogen peroxide in a sterilizer then. What's the difference between, hydrogen peroxide that would get sprayed on as a bleaching agent, say, in like the food industry, versus what we're doing with these low-temp sterilizers? What's that vaporized hydrogen peroxide process like? How does that work?
Yeah, so the way it works most sterilizers work with the same principle. So we start by vacuuming the chamber. So there's a strong pump that would remove all of the air. So the goal is to try to remove all air in the chamber, in the device, in the packaging, and get to a very low pressure, a deep vacuum. It's typically around 1 torr or a bit lower for some sterilizers. So that's kind of set up the stage for sterilization. Then peroxide, I mentioned, it's a liquid, but we want it in the gaseous phase. So it goes through a vaporizer that provides it with some heat to vaporize it. So you've got all of your peroxide molecules that are stick together as a liquid that get freed basically, and now they can get into the chamber as a gas. So that's the goal, is not inject any liquid, but inject peroxide as a vapor. So as you may know, vapor tends to kind of go everywhere, to occupy all of the volume available. So that's how the peroxide vapor can travel into the lumens, into the crevices. We want it to go everywhere that is accessible to do its job basically and sterilize. So that's the injection step. Some sterilizer inject a fixed amount, other inject to a fixed pressure, but the goal is to get enough peroxide to sterilize your load. Then there is typically sharp increase in pressure, pressure push either by injecting air or different gas that will furthermore drive the peroxide into the lumens mostly, but other hard to access area. And the peroxide there can react with the microorganisms that are hidden in your lumens, on the surfaces and cracks. And as I mentioned, it's a very reactive molecule. So when you've got enough peroxide on a microorganism, it will chemically destroy it, basically. After that phase, there's a few differences with sterilizer in the market. Some use plasma. There's another that use ozone. These two things would help reduce residual peroxide at the end of the cycle. Ozone, if it's used, add additional lethality. But regardless of if one or the other is used, after the injection and some exposure time, we gotta let peroxide some time to sit there and do its job. Then we vacuum the chamber. So the pump start again, remove everything, the peroxide, the water. There's always water there too because it's a mixture. And any byproduct gets removed by the pump. This goes through a catalyst. As we mentioned, we don't want peroxide to go out of the chamber as is, so it goes through a catalyst to break it down into water vapor and oxygen. And that's kind of the first phase, and there's always at least one repetition of that sterilization phase that provide a safety margin to the process. So in a nutshell, that's the sterilization for you. And at the end of it, there's we fill the chamber with air, and then evacuate one or a few times depending on the model to try to remove any residual sterilant in order for the device to be safe to handle and get to a patient.
Yeah. Well, you crammed a lot in there to that answer, Jean-Luc, so I want to go back and unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
I'll pause to say to our listeners, don't let me hog all the airtime here. If you have a burning question or you want clarification on, or something that you've been curious about low temp sterilization, feel free to type that if you're watching this live into the question and answer box on your conference screen, and we'll do our best to try to get to those as we go, if I can multitask effectively. So circling back around to your answer, I heard a lot of elements that sounds similar to the way a pre-vac sterilizer in steam would work. You know, you've got conditioning of the chamber with this vacuum. We're injecting this sterilant and steam. I suppose it would be a high-pressure saturated steam. You've got contact with all the instruments, and then we're vacuuming it out. So can you highlight maybe what are some of the differences in what's going on in that chamber between low-temp sterilization and steam sterilization? Because I'm sure they work in totally different ways.
They work in different ways, and this has an impact also on the way they would be used in an SPD. So one key difference is that peroxide work as a chemical sterilant and act only on the surface. So the peroxide molecule has to be able to reach wherever there's bug to sterilize. So it only acts on the surfaces, all the surfaces available. Well, the steam is a physical process, so it's the heat and pressure that will destroy the bugs and can go deeper, basically, because the heat transmits through material. So that's a difference, and one of the reasons why with an autoclave you can sterilize liquid but not with peroxide. A few other difference there, obviously the temperature, and it impacts how it can be used. So your low temp sterilizer, as the name implies, is at much lower temperature. Typically it's 40 to 55 Celsius, which would be 100 to 130 Fahrenheit. So that allow to process heat sensitive device. That's actually one of the main reasons to use a low temp sterilizer. Anything that would get destroyed in steam can be processed there. The low temp, as soon as the device goes out, can be used. It's patient ready. In steam, you kind of need a cool down period for these. Some other difference are really practical, like chamber size, the way the load is configured, type of packaging used. You mentioned cellulosic material paper before that can be used in steam, but not in peroxide.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I know, having used low temp sterilizers, there's a lot more considerations about lumen length and the number of lumens that can go in there. So what are some of the limitations of a low temp sterilization and the technology we have today and the types of things that we can sterilize?
Yeah, so limitations, I mean, they're different based on the models and cycle, but generally they go around type of device, and you mentioned lumen. So the lumen are very challenging to sterilize. We need the sterilant to penetrate through it. So the diameter and length of the lumen impacted. So there's specific claim per cycle in sterilizer that users need to be aware of. And other than that, geometry, weight, there's weight limitation not to exceed. So these are some of the limitations that user needs to be aware when they load the low temp sterilizer.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thinking between the two modalities, because in steam you still have some limitations about weight in the chamber and how densely you pack it in there, but it seems like it's much more forgiving in that regard, because we just have this nonstop high pressure saturated steam that gets everywhere in the chamber. And with it seems like with the hydrogen peroxide sterilizers, we're having to be a lot more careful about how we load the thing, because we have to make sure that sterilant can reach everything, and that there's an appropriate amount of sterilant to reach all of the surfaces. Would you say that summary is correct?
Yeah, I would say this is correct. I mean, I'm less familiar with steam in general. I would not advise not following the recommendation.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, with peroxide, it's very important to make sure that everything that goes in there respect the claims of the sterilizer, and also that the monitoring is done correctly with CI, BI, and PCD to ensure that any problem would be catched.
Sure. So before we move on and start talking about the future of this topic and the exciting things going on in the industry, I wanted to talk about the tail end of that cycle that you described, that evacuation process, because as we mentioned, at the concentrations that we're using hydrogen peroxide, they are very reactive and very dangerous. They're meant to kill, living organisms, and we are a living organism, and so we don't want that. We don't want that on and in us. So what are some of the considerations that go into the design process, the manufacturing process, to try to keep people safe while they're operating these machines?
Yeah, there are a few. I mean, obviously, safety is very important during the design of a sterilizer. So I think during the design, we think about it from the end user and the SPD, but also the patient. So if I start by the end user, the sterilizer got to be leak tight. We don't want any leak of sterilant going into the room. We got to make sure that the catalyst works properly and it can handle a lot of sterilant. So again, to make sure there's no peroxide going into the room. So the catalyst does a good job. It's a well-known technology to destroy peroxide into water, vapor, and oxygen. And the last thing is the breathing zone. So when your SPD worker open the door and open the package, that's where the last ventilation is very important, so that residual peroxide in the load are way below the limit that are acceptable to expose a worker. Yeah, and I guess also the bottle design, or the way that the sterilizer remove all sterilant before the bottle or the cassette is removed, is an important consideration. So that's on the user side. When we think about patient safety, it's different requirements. So the first one is very obvious. It's sterilization efficacy. We make sure that whatever goes in there within the claims should be sterile to prevent infection. That's the main purpose of the sterilizer. Biocompatibility is very important. So again, the residual peroxide, the design should allow for the sterilizer to remove almost all of the sterilant on the device. There's some trace of it, and it's fine as long as it's within the right limit. So manufacturer of sterilizer have to test the biocompatibility of different material and type of device. And the last one would be the device functionality itself. These are designed to reprocess medical device multiple times, and one of the considerations is to ensure that these devices stay functional for a long period of time to ensure user safety or patient safety.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a big consideration in the manufacturing process. Do you have any thoughts about the live monitoring of hydrogen peroxide in a workspace around these machines? I know there have been some studies that have gone around about hydrogen peroxide in the workspace around these machines. There are various companies that do that type of live monitoring for hydrogen peroxide. Do you have an opinion or a thought on that?
I'd say it's up to the facility to make a decision there, but when it's done, if it's well done, I think it's certainly good to reassure the user. I've got good trust in the sterilizer design from either our sterilizer or even our competitor sterilizer. I think are well designed to protect the user, but it's never the bad idea to add some additional layer of safety by monitoring.
Yeah, it's just interesting from a standards perspective, all of the consideration that goes into monitoring ETO, ethylene oxide sterilization. But when you look into the lethality and the effect of the sterilants between hydrogen peroxide and ethylene oxide, they both are very dangerous to people. And so it's just, I've always thought that peculiar that we have all of these requirements for monitoring one, but none for the other. But to your point, it is good to know that there's a lot of design and development that goes into keeping our users safe. All right. We had a couple of really great questions that came through, and one I just wanted to follow up on a comment that we made about the limitations of lumens being in the chamber. Somebody asked the question about sterilizing a say, a small diameter flexible scope that has a lumen channel using a hydrogen peroxide sterilizer. They just wanted clarification that the hydrogen peroxide can actually penetrate that lumen. They were concerned that we were saying it would only sterilize the surface of the scope.
Yeah, I mentioned surface, but I meant any accessible surfaces, and the lumen is part of it. So
right.
All of the interior of the channel is a surface. So yeah, lumens are open on both sides. The initial vacuum of the sterilizer, you remove all the air, and after that, peroxide, as the pressure of peroxide build in the chamber, can and will penetrate these lumen and sterilize up to the center of it. So that's good. Obviously, in the size that are validated for the specific sterilizer and cycle. Yeah,
for sure. Let's take a step back and just look at the industry as a whole. Jean-Luc, as you've been working in this space pretty intimately for the last many years, what are the big conversations that you're having over, say, the last 12 months about low-temp sterilization that you find exciting?
Yeah, I mean, right now, and that's fairly fresh, AMI ST91 on reprocessing of flexible scope and semi-rigid scope in the healthcare facility just came out. And I think it's a very hot topic right now. I've been involved in the working group, and I would say a lot of the very interesting discussion around that were within the group were like 2-3 years ago, but now that it's out, I think it's a topic in the field. I'm not spending a lot of time in SPD myself, being a R&D guy, but I did spend a lot of time discussing with our clinical specialists about how can we, as an industry, try to help user make that transition from high-level disinfection of some scope model to sterilization of endoscope.
Yeah, that's a big deal. So, like, how far along are we in that discussion of sterilizing endoscopes? Like, what dominoes still need to fall to start seeing that come to life?
Yeah, there's a lot of different things. I would say from a user perspective, I think, depending on the facility and type of scope, it may add some complexity to the process, or there might be a need to change process in SPD to get there. Another important consideration to be there is the design of flexible endoscopes. Some are well designed for low temp sterilization, and some were designed with high level disinfection in mind. So this is obviously something that takes significant amount of time. Flexible endoscope of OEM, it should spend time for the next generation of product, design them to sustain low temp sterilization. And obviously working with low temp sterilizer manufacturer would definitely help that process. So having collaboration would be very important to get there.
Yeah. So would you say at this point the bottleneck is probably more on the side of the scope manufacturers than it is on the equipment manufacturers, trying to build something that's durable enough to endure a sterilization process?
I think there's multiple different bottlenecks, and every player involved in the industry needs to do their part there. So it's not just on the scope manufacturer. I think sterilizer manufacturer also, but also SPD to adapt their workflow, and like hospital to make sure they got the right inventory, that the people got the right training to get there.
Yeah, for sure. What else? Anything else interesting going on in the industry conversations that you're excited about?
I mean, in general, a lot of my discussion are internal about what to do, so I won't get too much there. But we're trying to see how can we provide the end user with be able to do more with less and facilitate the workflow. Anything related to facilitating the workflow of SPD is critical for us manufacturer, and think about that all the time.
Yeah, sure. So I know that you don't spend much or any time directly with the sterile processing departments because you're working more with the design of the equipment. But is there anything actionable that you can think of that our audience would be able to start improving in themselves or in their department today, related to their low temp sterilizer quality or their workflow or efficiency or cost savings or any of those types of things?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's two things I'd like to talk about that are impacting low temp sterilization, and it's cleaning and drying of instrument. Very important for successful low temp sterilization. So if I start with cleaning, but a potential for failure in sterilization is interaction between the sterilant and residual chemical from the cleaning process left on the device. So it's very important for end user to make sure that they follow the cleaning agent or the washer IFU for the proper dosage, right rinsing condition, temperature. Checking water quality also is of crucial importance. I think you've got John Waller later today, so I'm sure you will talk about water quality.
It's going to be a big trip too. Yeah, John's a hoot. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So and just to provide a bit more detail about how it can impact low temp sterilization. So the first one I kind of touch on, if you've got residual chemical on your device or even on your packaging when it goes into the low temp sterilizer because the dosage was wrong or because a rinsing condition were not correctly done, some of these chemicals can interact with the peroxide. And if it reacts with it, the peroxide is no longer available to do its job for sterile efficacy. So that's one obvious way. One that is a bit more insidious is that over time, if the condition of cleaning are not adequate, they can damage device or packaging in a way that will impact sterile efficacy or the process in general. And I've got one example. It was a facility that we supported a few years ago that kept having positive VI in their PCD. And through the investigation to understand the cause for it, our clinical team on the field, they identified an issue, or they thought that the tray they were using was problematic, so they shipped back the tray to our lab for some analysis. And what we found out is that aluminum tray was destroying peroxide. But the tray model we knew was compatible. We validated it, and we knew it was compatible with peroxide. So through investigation, we kind of deduced that the tray went through cleaning with high-level high pH detergent, which is not good for aluminum trays, and kind of stripped the anodization layer, damaged the tray itself, and some contaminant got lodged. By the naked eye, you would not see it, but these trays were damaged in a way that was impacting the sterilization process. So that's just something important to keep in mind. Cleaning is super important and will impact the rest of the process after. And if I can go to my second thing is drying. Low temp sterilization require the device, but also the packaging to be dry. We don't want liquid water to go into that chamber because that will create some failure of the sterilization process, or it could create failure. So very important to dry the device and make sure that even locations that are not visible by the naked eye get dry.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about what the big deal is with water and a hydrogen peroxide sterilizer. We talked some about the cellulose products where, you don't want to put paper or sawdust in there, but why is water such a big deal, and why are the machines aborting because of the water? What are the hazards with it?
Yeah, so two things, and I'll explain the why of it, I think, so it makes more sense to people. So I explained that the first step of the low temp sterilizer is we start the pump and try to remove all of the air to reduce the pressure in the chamber. So the water, as we go into low pressures, will start evaporate. So that evaporation will basically take longer to reach the target pressure. And for safety reason, all of these sterilizers would have a specific timer that if the target pressure is not reached in the time that is recommended, then the cycle aborts. So that's one failure mode that will abort the cycle. If you've got too much water in there, the sterilizer may not reach the right pressure and just abort the cycle. Something else that can happen also is for the water to go into the vapor phase require energy. So water will take its energy wherever it can. So it will either take energy from its surrounding, it could be the device or the packaging that the droplets are sitting on. In these cases, these surface their temperature will go down significantly as they pass heat water to allow the water to go out. And in some cases, your water droplets, if it's sitting on a surface that is not a good heat conductor, the water itself will start to cool down, and sometime up to a point that it will freeze, and you'll have some small pocket of ice on your load. So be it ice that remains there, or even if you cool down some surface, peroxide will condensate there. And if you got too much condensation of peroxide, it's possible at the end of the cycle there could be droplets of peroxide left in the load. So that's obviously a danger for exposure. So cycle abort and potential exposure are reason not to let water in the load.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's kind of weird thinking about there being ice in a chamber for a cycle that's going to get up to 130 degrees, right? So that's really interesting to think about.
And it's very localized. It's just at the point where the droplets is, but depending on the amount, It could be too much. And peroxide condensing will do the other thing I mentioned earlier. It will prevent it from being available to do its job.
Right. And so if you had that residual hydrogen peroxide in that one localized spot where there was too much water, could that potentially be a risk factor to people handling the device after the sterilization cycle?
It could.
Yeah. I've seen and talked to a lot of people in the industry about using hydrogen peroxide sterilizers and people getting a hydrogen peroxide burn on their fingers, and their finger turns white because they handled something that came right out of the sterilizer and weren't wearing gloves when they were doing so. And who knows what or why, but it sounds like one of the possible causes to that is that they didn't have their instruments dry enough before it went in there.
Yeah, typically I think that would be the cause for it.
Yeah, for sure. What else? What should we talk about next? Jean-Luc. So thinking back to the flexible endoscopes, do you think we're ever going to get to the place where we've got 100% sterilization of scopes, or do you think high-level disinfection is here to stay?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know the time frame, but I certainly hope that we'll get there. I think terminal sterilization of a flexible endoscope is the better standard of care. But yeah, I mentioned earlier there's some challenge to get there, so it will take some time. So when I was on the working committee for ST91, there was a lot of long and sometimes heated discussion around how do we get there. And I think there was a general agreement in that working group that it was a better standard of care and we should get there. But especially on the user side, oftentimes there was people identified some barrier to get there in changing the workflow or adding requirement, not having sufficient. Adding the burden basically on the user. So the document I think was well prepared with that idea of setting the direction for the industry to get there without putting too much burden on the user, because obviously there's a need for a transition period that will take who knows how many years.
Yeah, it definitely would take a while. So as we think about the industry as a whole, as it stands now, where do you think some of the myths and misconceptions are around hydrogen peroxide, or maybe stated another way, where are we missing the mark with low temp sterilization?
Yeah, I think some myth and misconception is that for an SPD to use a sterilizer to sterilize a specific device, the device IFU should contain the sterilizer. So when a device manufacturer validate their medical device to get them into the field, they will validate a limited number of reprocessing method, sterilization or high-level disinfection, and these gets in the IFU of the device. But after launch, if there's additional validation that is done, it takes a long time for a med device manufacturer to update their IFU. So sometimes the validation exists, it's out there, but it's not in the IFU, and these would come as in the form of customer memo most of the time, which act as an extension of the IFU in this case. But something related to is that the validation of compatibility does not have to be the sole responsibility of the instrument manufacturer. It can also be done by the sterilizer manufacturer. That is something that has been addressed in the latest version of ST91. So it used to say that SPD should confirm with the instrument OEM the compatibility. Now it says that SPD should get the information from the instrument manufacturer and or the sterilizer manufacturer. So the work is not always done by the same party. Actually, some device manufacturer won't post-launch, they won't validate anything. They're happy to provide device to sterilizer or disinfection manufacturer so that these would do their own validation to be able to provide to user.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So say that I'm Johnny Clipboard managing my sterile processing department, and I've got an instrument IFU in front of me that lists one specific type of sterilizer in the IFU, and I don't have that kind of sterilizer, but you're saying maybe that validation exists out there somewhere. Where do I go to get that information? How would I get some kind of validation documentation to be able to sterilize that instrument?
Yeah, so I think the information can come from both the instrument or the sterilizer manufacturer. So I think starting just by first contact a sales rep to try to get that information would work. From the sterilizer side, most sterilizer manufacturers put out their compatibility matrix that lists all of the devices they have validated. So it's easily accessible to the end user to get that information. I think some instrument manufacturers also have some type of compatibility matrix that will supplement what's in the IFU as far as compatibility of diverse reprocessing method for their device. Yeah.
I just want to highlight this one more time because I think this is a really practical point for our sterile processing folks out there. It's not all that common to have administrative teams consult sterile processing when they're considering buying some new instrument system, and so we get the news that we've got this new instrument that's going to be used for a new procedure, and we look at the IFU, and according to the sterilization instructions in there, we don't have the equipment that we need to sterilize it. That very well may be the case, but it is worth that extra step of investigation to reach out to that instrument manufacturer or to the sterilization modalities that you do have and see if anybody has conducted a validation study with that instrument. Because depending on how old the system is, it may not be written in that IFU. So that's a great call out, Jean-Luc, and I think that's really helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely.
So since we're talking about IFUs, there was a really good question that somebody raised about what they called cross-sterilization, meaning they have some instruments that normally would be sterilized in steam sterilization, but because of circumstances, either that equipment was down or they couldn't wait for the cooling time, they wanted to sterilize it in a different mode using their hydrogen peroxide sterilizer. Is that appropriate to be sterilizing instruments in a different sterilization modality than what you usually do?
I think it can be appropriate, but the same effort needs to go into making sure that the device that are to be reprocessed in low temp, and even the load configuration if they're to go with other things are validated and that the device meet the claim of the sterilizer basically. So it's feasible, but there's some work to make sure that that the user doesn't go basically against the claim of the sterilizer. From steam to peroxide, I think I'm not seeing any incompatibility in chemicals. I think from going to different chemical type of sterilization, a user needs to be extra careful that there's no incompatibility from switching to one modality to another.
That's really helpful. And so when you're talking about doing that extra due diligence of making sure that the instruments can go through that sterilization modality, that goes beyond just the sterilization method listed in the IFU, right? If you were pulling your stainless steel ortho instruments for a total knee revision, that those stainless steel instruments may be validated to go through the sterilizer, but you also have to think about the density of how they're packed in there and how heavy they are as well, right?
Correct. There's typically weight requirement for every sterilization cycle on low temp.
Yeah, and so that's something to be careful about with all of the with all the push and emphasis on efficiency and people trying to avoid using immediate use sterilization, there have been some pretty wacky attempts to run instruments through their low temp sterilizer just because it's faster. And so, yeah, let's be people of the book. Let's go back to our validation studies and make sure that both the sterilizer and the instrument say that sterilization method is appropriate. Are there any special considerations to be made regarding sterilizing implants in a low-temp sterilizer?
Yeah, again, making sure that the implant sterilization is covered by the claim of the sterilizer. If I'm not sure about all of the low temp out there. If I think about our own system, it's not validated for implants, so it should not go in there.
Gotcha.
So, no, absolutely important, especially if switching from steam to a low temp and there's an implant in there, the user got to be aware that it may not be validated for it. I mentioned earlier about when we've talked about safety, biocompatibility study, they have to be conducted based on the use of the device. So if it's for a reusable device to be used on the patient just for a procedure, typically it's done with a part of the standard that deal to patient contact for 24-hour or lower. So if it's an implant going to be longer, well, obviously much longer into the patient, maybe the right validation were not done with the sterilizer. So yeah, again, going to the IFU, if an uncertainty, talking with the manufacturer directly.
Yeah, that's really helpful. As I've been talking with sterile processing professionals in the field, when I ask them the question, what would you like to see out of your low temp sterilizer? The two pain points for sterile processing are one, aborted loads because of moisture, which we kind of already talked about, and the other one has to do with throughput. I'm curious what your perspective is on why the chamber size and the capacity size for low temp sterilizers is so small when you compare it to these giant steam autoclaves, and even sometimes the ETO chambers are very large in comparison. Why are the chambers so small for hydrogen peroxide sterilizers?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know that I fully know the answer, but I think I've got a good guess that it's mostly related to the historical use of low temp sterilizers. So historically, low temp has been created for kind of a niche market of the devices that are very complex, that an hospital would not have ton of them to reprocess at the same time and would not want to load one device into a very large chamber, as opposed to steam that kind of has always been doing kind of everything else. So it makes sense to have a large chamber for throughput. So as there is more and more devices that go into low temp, that may make sense to have larger chamber. And I don't think there's a technology limitation there. I know that there's some peroxide larger chamber that exists for industrial sterilization, so it's feasible to do. I don't know that at this point there was sufficient need for the OEM to invest into that, but going into the future, if it's a need sufficient by the end user, I think the industry will pick that up and develop these larger chamber peroxide sterilizer.
That's really interesting. And I see where you're coming from with that statement, because as it stands, hydrogen peroxide is, when compared to steam on a per cycle basis, I would imagine would be a little bit more expensive, even with that smaller chamber. Because with steam, once you've invested in the infrastructure for it and you have it, it's not that much more expensive to run a cycle. But if you're constantly buying more sterilant for your hydrogen peroxide sterilizer, it would probably be wasteful to have to buy the amount to sterilize this huge chamber if you only had 2 cameras to put in there. So I can see that.
Yeah, a larger chamber definitely would help some larger facility, but I'm sure a lot of smaller facility probably don't have a need for a much larger chamber, while having 2 or 3 smaller sterilizer may give them more flexibility in their workflow.
Yeah. One more question before we talk a little bit about ozone, because I would be remiss not to at least have a question or two in there from the TSO3 guy about ozone and its place in this industry. But we have a question from one of our listeners about what to do if your sterilizer aborts mid-cycle, or if a cassette or sterilant cup is ejected. What do we do with that sterilant cup or that sterilant cassette that may still be active?
Oh, interesting question. So that's a new one to me. Our system doesn't have a cassette and would never be ejected mid-cycle. So maybe if that happened and there's still sterilant in it, that's got to be handled like a dangerous material for sure. So hopefully the facility has policy in place and the right resource to deal with an hazardous material. It should not be disposed of in like regular trash for sure.
Yeah. I would just I would point everybody to consult your IFU for that sterilant cup and how to handle it, because I'm sure if they're marketing it as such, they're going to have something to do in that situation if it does get ejected.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's wrap up this conversation by talking a little bit about ozone. I suspect that the majority of our listeners don't have a significant amount of experience with it. So can you tell us, what's useful about ozone in the low temp sterilization discussion, and why you think it's important?
Yeah, so ozone specifically in our system, which I think is the only one that has it in the cycle, is used paired with peroxide. So peroxide does a lot of the workhorse sterilization, and ozone kind of two things: an additional lethality, basically making the cycle more efficient to sterilize in long lumen, especially. And it's also helped with the reduction of residual peroxide on the device. So what we've discussed, biocompatibility, we want to control peroxide on the device at the end of the cycle. So ozone helped with that. And ozone going through the same catalyst is transformed into pure oxygen, so O2, which is safe for the user and environment.
Gotcha. And so to summarize, you would say that the introduction of ozone is adding a second method of sterilization on top of the hydrogen peroxide just for additional efficacy? Or I guess what are the benefits if we have the units out there that are operating without the ozone? Like what does it add?
Yeah, so one other thing that ozone does for us in adding lethality is the ability to sterilize longer lumen. So this system has some claims on much longer lumen than other out there, such as colonoscope and gastroscope.
Gotcha.
Which
and
are
so
not be covered by other peroxide sterilizer.
Right. And so I guess that goes back to our discussion around the industry's movement towards figuring out how we're going to sterilize these large endoscopes with really large lumens. Having the capability at the sterilizer level is one piece of it, but there's also the scope manufacturers being able to handle that, and then everybody's favorite topic of regulation and trying to navigate that such that those claims are validated. So I'm sure there's much more to do on that. From a practical perspective, in getting the ozone, I'm sure it's not something that you buy in a bottle or ask your boiler room to put together. So how is that introduced to the sterilization process?
Yeah, so one of the input of the sterilizer is oxygen. So it can come from just a tank, but typically for our system we sell just an oxygen concentrator that takes it from the air and just concentrate oxygen. And then the ozone generator is part of the sterilizer. So the user will never see it. It's inside the sterilizer, and just the right amount of ozone that is needed for the cycle is created during the cycle and nothing more. So ozone is never stored. It's just produced to go into the chamber, and any amount of ozone that's used or even used will go through the catalyst. So no, user doesn't need to procure any ozone to go in the system. It's a gas basically produced within the sterilizer.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your thoughts with us today. I think this has been my favorite session on the day so far, just getting to dig into the details of how sterilization works. As we think about education, which is something that we think about a lot at Beyond Clean, how to get information to technicians, just reflecting on my own experience as a sterile processing technician, this is an area that I was a bit mystified by. You know, I had a rough idea how a washer works, a rough idea how a steam sterilizer works, but we have this chemical box that we stick things in, and it's able to accomplish sterility without all of the high temperature. And really, all that we know is it's a chemical process. Rather than using heat and steam, it's using chemicals, and that's really all that the sterile processing technicians get. So we would love to see at Beyond Clean just a bigger emphasis in the industry about low temp sterilization education, going to technicians, the practical aspects of how it works in the chamber, what we're doing. Because whenever you understand those things, whenever you have a good grasp of the importance of something, it tends to drive home compliance a little bit better. So maybe people would understand a little bit more clearly why it's important to have those instruments bone dry, or have the instruments be rinsed very, very well to make sure that there's no residual detergent on there, because they know the risks of what can happen, because they understand what goes on in their sterilizer. So I just want to say thank you for being a part of spreading that education. We're doing our little piece of it to try to get the information out there. And for you educators and managers who are listening, or sterilizer manufacturers who are listening, or consultants who are listening, I would just appeal to you to put together some great education around this topic for your sterile processing technicians, and let's keep elevating the industry in this particular area. Jean-Luc, I'll give you the last word. Is there anything else that you want to share with our listeners today?
I think I've shared plenty, but I want to thank you, Bobby. It's been really fun. I really appreciate it. So see you next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, see you next time. Thanks so much for joining us, folks. That was Jean-Luc Lemyre with Stryker, and we are so thankful to him to have him on this education series, the Experts Conference. Also, I want to invite you to connect with Jean-Luc if you had a question that we did not manage to get to throughout the course of the conversation, or if you're listening to this by audio or by recording, feel free to connect with him either by email, or you can find him on LinkedIn. Thanks again. See ya.